I invite you to place yourself in the Garden of Eden. Imagine walking on a carpet of the softest grass, the kind you could lie down and fall asleep in. The smell of jasmine, honeysuckle, and gardenia delight your senses. Beautiful peonies and roses are in bloom. Butterflies flitter around and draw your attention upwards. God cared about man's needs and his desire for beauty, and his creation in the garden reflects both those things. God made trees that were simply gorgeous for their own sake, and also trees that were good for food. And there were two very special trees in the garden: the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God said that man could eat of any tree in the garden, except for one. The fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was not to be eaten. The second tree, the tree of life, represented eternal life. And this was not just in the sense of something being endless, but in the sense of providing total fullness of life, the fulfillment of the deepest desires, and an absolute satiation of what man longs for. Adam and Eve at the beginning of time had full access to that tree. There was no suffering, no trauma, no heaviness, no anxiety, no eating disorders, no suicide, no depression. Eating from that tree supplied a complete, endless experience of total fulfillment. And this is how life was meant to be. But something happened that changed everything. Try to look at this story through the lens of a true myth, looking beyond the physical things like trees and fruit and snakes to the truth being revealed. Stay with me in the story, allowing the metaphors to play out without getting bogged down in questions that this story was never meant to answer. It's not meant to teach you science, but it is meant to explain to you what went wrong in this beautiful world that God created. Why are things so messed up? It's here that I need to share the bad news. Because someone entered the beautiful garden and sabotaged the original plan. And this part gets a little heavy. But the truth I'm going to share about with you is so important. It's what no one wants to talk about because we're so desperate for hope and for something to make us feel better. But if I don't share the bad news, then the good news doesn't feel like that big a deal. So the tree of life wasn't the only tree. There was also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. As we saw at the very beginning of time, God told Adam and Eve to stay away from that tree. What was the big deal with that tree? Well, grabbing fruit from that tree was the equivalent of trying to be like God, trying to figure it all out for ourselves. It was saying, I'll decide. I'm in charge. Eating fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then and now, is a rejection of God as the ultimate authority. It's deciding to take matters into your own hands because God doesn't seem to be doing a very good job. You might be wondering why God would have created a tree like this in the first place and why he'd placed it in the garden. Why put a temptation right in the path of Adam and Eve? Wasn't he just setting them up for failure? To answer this question, it's essential to remember that in order to love, we must be free. Love is a gift that one chooses to offer. God is love, and he created man to share in his love. In order for Adam and Eve to love authentically, an element of choice had to be introduced into the garden. In creating this particular tree, God presented an opportunity for Adam and Eve to choose to enter into a loving relationship with him. And while it's tempting to see this tree as an unfair test placed in the garden by an unreasonable God, in truth, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was the height of God's generosity towards Adam and Eve. Without God's help, man could not and cannot enter into a relationship with the Creator. His greatest gift to Adam and Eve was a way to love him by choosing to obey him about this tree. And just as Lucifer had been able to choose to love God above all else or to reject him, Adam and Eve would face a similar point of decision. And this was the moment that Lucifer had been waiting for and watching for. But God was watching too, in hopes that Adam and Eve would choose to trust him. He would not force them to trust him, but he hoped they would. Satan, disguised as a serpent, slithered up to Eve and said, "Did God say you can't eat from any tree in the garden?" He introduced the thought of God holding back something that Eve would want. And it's interesting that he didn't lead Eve to question God's existence. He was fine with her thinking that God existed. He tempted her to question God's goodness. He planted a seed of doubt, suggesting that God wasn't really for her. In fact, he said God was really holding out on her because he was afraid that if she ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that she would be like God. If you think about it, Lucifer tempted her to reach out and grasp something that she already had. Eve already was like God, made in his image and likeness. God had already infused her with all that was good and beneficial. But instead of stopping and thinking about all that God had so generously given, all the ways in which God had proven to be trustworthy, the abundance of God's goodness to both her and Adam, Eve turned her focus to what she could grab hold of without his help. We know how the story goes. Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and when they did, they were sent out of the garden. God placed cherubim and a gleaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. We read that in Genesis 3, verse 24. Why? Because continuing to eat from the tree of life would have kept them endlessly in a state that was no longer good. God didn't want to leave them in that state. This is because something happened when man ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Something really significant was lost. In the words of Augustine, when the soul rebelled against God, the body rebelled against the soul. And this means that things within us are not going to work the way that God intended them to. We are going to experience a mess within. Doing the right thing is not going to come easy for us. We're going to make decisions that shoot ourselves in the foot. And I'm not even talking about all the things that other people do that wound us. I'm talking about what we do to ourselves. Do you ever wonder why things are so messed up? Eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is where it all began.